The conversation today focuses on climate reparations and the upcoming major global climate change conference, which you'll hear referred to as COP27. By way of background, I started my professional life in environmental management, moved to media, where I've been for over 25 years. I'm also an attorney. And I'm coming to you from Jamaica, a small island developing state. We're in the Caribbean, where there are many small and vulnerable states. And right now, we're less than 2 weeks away from the 27th United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference. You'll probably hear it referred to as the UNFCCC conference that's going to be taking place in Egypt. We're going to be talking about what small and vulnerable states hope to achieve at this major event, what's at stake, what do they want? Since 1992, small island states have been calling for funding for loss and damage from climate change, but we haven't seen a lot of progress on the issue. Loss and damage has been a contentious issue at each of the climate change conferences, and we're pretty sure that's going to be the same at this upcoming COP27. We'll also be talking about the efforts of small and vulnerable countries to seek justice for the impacts of climate change outside of the COP space. Within the next month, the United Nations General Assembly will be voting on whether the International Court of Justice can consider a landmark climate change case. This vote is being brought to the General Assembly by Vanuatu, and it's really important. It could break new ground in the fight against climate change. It's clear that small island states have got tired of waiting and are exploring every avenue in a desperate attempt to protect their countries and their people. Last year, Antigua and Barbuda, a small island state here in the Caribbean, joined with Tuvalu in the Pacific and established a Commission of Small Island States on International Law. The Commission will be seeking an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea on climate harm to islands on the front line. We have a fantastic panel to discuss and break down all these issues for you. I'm asking them to turn on their videos now. We have Rueanna Haynes, Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean, also climate negotiator for CARICOM, that's a Caribbean community, and the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. We also have with us Dr. Margaretha Wewerinke-Singh, Assistant Professor of Public International Law at Leiden University, and she also leads the legal team that's supporting that pursuit of an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Harjeet Singh is with us, Head of Global Political Strategy at Climate Action Network International, and Dr. Keston is a political economist and Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Williams College in the United States. And later on, we're going to be hearing as well from Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, who is a UN climate change high-level champion for Egypt. I feel we almost need a drum roll after each of those names. They're so impressive. We're also going to be taking your questions at specific points in the discussion, so please drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. And I already see the chat is very, very active with people introducing themselves and giving some background, so that's fantastic to see. Let's kick it off, because in this first segment, we want to talk about progress since COP26. Now, I'm going to start with you, Harjeet Singh, because after COP26, in acknowledging that we did see language acknowledging increasing loss and damage caused by climate change, you said to Reuters, however, the failure to put a fund in place to help poorer nations pay those costs means that we are walking in inches when we need to move in miles. So how many inches, if any, have we come since last year?
Thank you so much, Dionne, and thanks to Commonwealth Foundation for organizing this very important conversations before COP27, and also putting the issue of loss and damage right at the center. This is what we have achieved since COP26, if you ask me, to be honest, because for the last 10 years, we have been fighting to put loss and damage finance on the agenda. And the biggest achievement that we have got just in the last few weeks, actually, to ensure that loss and damage finance is going to be discussed by 200 nations, first time at COP27. Now, for your audience, I must underline that this is quite significant, because for the last 30 years, developing nations have been reminding that we have emissions that are locked into the atmosphere, which means impacts are going to be there, and we are not prepared to deal with those climate impacts. And there is a missing piece in the architecture of UNFCCC to help people recover from the impacts. And we all know that we are already seeing climate emergency around the world. People are suffering, and there is not enough support available to them to recover from these impacts. At this moment, there is some resources available for people if they want to green their economy, to put it simply, or if they want to prepare from climate impacts, but not when they are hit by climate disasters such as floods, cyclones, and rising seas. So what we have achieved is putting it on the agenda. And the reason I said we are walking in inches when we must move in miles, because we should have established such a system at least 10 years ago, because small island states raised that demand in 1991.
Let me bring in Rueanna Haynes and ask you to pick up from there. We've achieved the goal, or we've managed to put it on the agenda. How significant for you is that in terms of progress?
It's extraordinarily significant. Hi, Dionne, and I'm happy to come in after Harjeet on this. He's quite correct. This has been an issue sort of bubbling around in the background since before the UNFCCC came into being as a convention. It was successfully kept off the agenda until I think things came to a head while we were in the process of negotiating what became the Paris Agreement. Loss and damage nearly derailed the COP that was held in Qatar in 2012. By the time we got to Warsaw in 2013, we had the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which was a significant step forward within the process, because it was the first time that loss and damage had become a part in terms of the institutional setup under the UNFCCC in the history of the convention. Small island developing states or the developing countries were able to build upon this in the context of the Paris Agreement to ensure that loss and damage was taken into account. And we now have Article 8 of the Paris Agreement establishing loss and damage as a pillar alongside mitigation, adaptation, finance, a pillar, a thematic pillar in the context of global cooperation and climate change. But I think in terms of significant advancements since COP26, we have a key number of policy relevant decisions or outcomes that have come out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process that really will help us to continue to advance this issue. So the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, their Working Group 2 report came out earlier this year in February, and they have included 4 key messages that I want to leave with you this morning. The first is that weather and climate extremes are on the rise and pushing people and ecosystems beyond the limits of what they can adapt to. The second is that losses and damages are inevitable and will occur despite adaptation. And in particular, they will escalate as we breach the 1.5C warming limit. The third is that even if we are able to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, loss and damage will not be eliminated. It will still occur. And finally, even the IPCC has recognized that current financial, governance, and institutional arrangements to address loss and damage are insufficient. And this is a really key advancement that sets us up to be able to push this issue forward at COP27. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point at which to bring in Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry, from where you sit, what has prevented us from making more progress?
I think the question of what are the stumbling blocks has to deal with, in part, has to do with the history of how we've arrived here. And I think the Commonwealth as an organization and as an emblem and a relic of the colonial past has a part to play in that. When we think about colonial history of many of the countries of the Caribbean with which I'm most familiar, as well as Pakistan. We're talking about India and so on. I think most of these countries are quote unquote Commonwealth countries. And the histories of one, I think we have to contend with the history and the past in order to understand where we're at in terms of the present. And in terms of contending with that past, the Commonwealth has some role to play in contending with that past and has a very, very important role in understanding what role it has played in continuing some of the exploitation and some of the kinds of damage and destruction many of these countries are facing today. So that's one thing. We have not been very honest to come to terms with that history and to come to terms with how we have arrived here. The next question is how are these how the damage and destruction is continuing and what is causing much of this. We know that many of the countries in the global north, for example, are responsible for many of the kinds of excess atmospheric space that they have taken up, much of the climate debt that these countries owe to the global south countries, especially many in the Caribbean. They have not paid and they've not wanted to address some of those issues. And it has a lot to do with power politics, both at the global level, but also at various scales. And an important part has to do with just facing up to those particular facts of why are we here and how do we address it going forward.
Well, I'll tell you something, before we end this morning's discussion, I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Perry, and ask for ideas from you as well as the other panelists, of course, in terms of how the Commonwealth, given that particular history, can in fact help us now in moving forward on this issue of climate reparations, and especially in relation to the upcoming COP. So I take note of your points there, and we are going to be coming back to them to see how we can in fact make progress on that particular issue. Okay, I want to move on to the next topic here, where I want to bring in Dr. Wewerinke-Singh, because we also want to talk about the kind of initiatives that we've seen over the past year. And Dr. Wewerinke-Singh, let me acknowledge right at the outset that I'm going to be asking you an essay question, but we only have time for short answers. In that, I want you to talk to us a little bit about the work that is being done in terms of seeking the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Can you explain for us the significance of this?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Basically, there's a youth campaign, and the youth activists put the idea in very simple and clear terms. It's about bringing the world's biggest problem to the world's highest court. It's the idea of bringing climate change before the International Court of Justice is not new. As early as 2002, Tuvalu announced its intention to bring Australia and the United States before the International Court of Justice for lack of sufficiently ambitious climate action. That idea was never pursued. Then a few years later, Palau announced that it would build a coalition, and it indeed started to build a coalition to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on basically the application of the no harm rule on the international law to climate change. So there was significant pushback from primarily the United States at the time, which then led Palau to drop the initiative, but the initiative was kept alive by civil society primarily. And it was in 2019 that a group of young law students from the University of the South Pacific advocated for the issue to be picked up by Pacific leaders, and Vanuatu then decided to run with the idea and start building a coalition of states to ensure the adoption of a resolution by the UN General Assembly that would request the advisory opinion from the ICJ, because one country, one state cannot by itself request an advisory opinion. it needs to be done by a duly authorized UN organ or body. In this case, the organ of choice is the UN General Assembly, because, for example, the UN Security Council would not do this. It would be vetoed by one of the permanent 5 members in all likelihood. The UN General Assembly can adopt a resolution by a simple majority of states. So that basically means that climate vulnerable states could, amongst themselves, decide to build this coalition and have the numbers. And so the rest of the world can join or cannot join, but it works differently than it does in the climate negotiations, where consensus is always needed.
Okay, I'm gonna jump back in, because I did say to you, essay questions, I know they're complex questions, but of course we have time issues. So could I just briefly ask you then to compare what we're seeing being done in that situation to the work that's being done by the Commission of Small Island States, which now wants to seek an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea? Is any of those approaches inherently more significant or more useful than the other?
So I would say they are complementary. They're very different and very complementary routes. So the International Court of Justice has general jurisdiction. It can look at the issue of climate change and climate damage from the perspective of basically all fields of international law. That is climate change law, but also human rights law, the law of the sea, customary international law. Now, the Law of the Sea Tribunal, ITLAS, is a specialized tribunal. So it looks mainly at questions that arise under UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So these questions that can be posed to ITLAS would be more specific. Now, also the pathway to follow is different. So for an advisory opinion from the ICJ, Vanuatu has decided to go through the UN General Assembly. So all UN member states are asked to support, but a simple majority of member states, UN member states at least, must vote in favor of the initiative. Now, what Antigua and Barbuda with Tuvalu, Palau, and also Niue have done is to create a new entity, the Commission on Small Island States and International Law. They have simply drafted a treaty which establishes this new commission. And that commission, by virtue of the treaty that establishes it, has the mandate to request an advisory opinion from ITLAS. So there's no need to persuade any other states to join this initiative. They have themselves established this institution, and so can basically go ahead anytime with requesting that opinion.
Okay, Rueanna, Haynes, how do these kinds of questions of international law and efforts at the international level affect the activists, the NGOs on the ground?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for, especially when it comes to the ICJ initiative, what is really interesting is it's a grassroots initiative. So it is activists on the ground that have persuaded a government here, the government of Vanuatu, to run with this. And it's also the youth, mainly youth campaign. It has become a global youth campaign supported now by more than 1,500 civil society organizations from around the world. They're advocating governments from around the world to support this, but also really providing input into the question. So one of the big demands from the youth is to make sure that human rights are put at the center of this effort. So
let me just, if I could, Doctor, ask Rueanna Haynes then to weigh in on that.
Thank you, Dionne, and thank you, Dr. Wewerinke-Singh, for that really excellent outline. I don't think, Dionne, that I have much to add to complement what Dr. Singh has said on this. From where I sit, it's been really valuable to have this plethora of different actions happening in the context of international law on this issue of loss and damage. I think it's helped to focus the minds of civil society, at least in the Caribbean in particular, on this big ask. And it has allowed civil society organizations to really start to rally around climate change questions and climate change issues in a way that we haven't necessarily seen in the past. I think on this particular issue, it's been able to capture the attention of people in a very real and tangible way. They feel as though they have a stake in what is being discussed, and they want to be a part of the solution, and they want to be a part of this push. So thank you to Dr. Singh and her network for all of the fantastic work that is being done here.
Harjeet Singh, how then would you assess how the Commission of Small Island States has been able to amplify and to increase the voices of small island states? How do you assess their impact over the years since they've been formed?
It's really important to make sure that we have all the tools in the toolkit when we talk about making progress on loss and damage, and all the initiatives, whether it's the commission that's making a lot of effort, or the now new momentum towards ICJ and what we are negotiating under UNFCCC. All three are different dimensions through which we are pushing the international system to respond to the crisis that we are facing. And that has been extremely useful to, one, raise awareness and put pressure on the policymakers to come to the table. Because we would like to have a system in place so that people, when they suffer from climate impacts, get sufficient support to recover. And the reality is that they're not getting. And in fact, there was a report by Oxfam which quotes that only 50% of the humanitarian appeals have been funded over the last 5 years. And we all know that humanitarian appeals do not represent the real cost of loss and damage. So we need to make efforts at all levels to raise awareness and to put pressure on policymakers, because we urgently need a system as people continue to suffer.
Dr. Perry, how much, I don't want to say the word life at all, but how much have these new initiatives, you think, galvanized and given renewed hope to the climate crisis movement in the small island states?
I think they have been very, very helpful. I think both at the level of COP, but also in the streets, right? So we've seen a number of young people, but also affected people who've been affected by major climate impacts around the world, actually taking to the streets and making it known to major fossil fuel companies, to governments, to a number of other entities that have had a really important role to play in accelerating the climate crisis to the point that we're at. So there have been a number of efforts, especially at the ground level and the street level, which I think some of us owe a lot of debt to those groups, to those activists, to some of those people who have really taken the responsibility, but also put their own reputations, their lives, and their own families at risk to take these kinds of actions. So it's really, really a ground level kind of activism that we've seen, especially around the question of reparations over the last year or so, where young people, a number of different kinds of climate activist groups have put the center of reparations put reparations at the center of their demand for a just transition and for climate justice.
This whole conversation about a loss and damage finance facility raises the question of how does it work? How would it work? What would it look like? And let me come back to you on this, Rueanna, because climate analytics has pointed out that funding for loss and damage has to be separate from funding for adaptation. And importantly, that it has to be structured differently. Saying, for instance, on the website that under the Green Climate Fund, it takes around 1 year from project submission to receiving the first disbursement. So if not the traditional kind of project-based structure, what can we be talking about? What could we be looking at?
Thanks, Dionne. No, it's a good question. And it's one that I think we will be getting into substantively, perhaps not this year, but maybe next year in the context of the global conversation. So far, what is clear is that the fund needs to be responsive to the actual needs on the ground, which already takes it outside the scope of the existing arrangements. So in the context of what the Alliance of Small Island States has put forward, actually, they are requesting a multilateral fund, one that is fit for purpose and one that is based on particular principles, acknowledging the fact that the existing arrangements are inadequate, that is cooperative and facilitative, and that also involves civil society actively, and where SIDS will have a voice. So they've already set out on a very high level some of the ways in which this fund needs to be very different from what already exists. And that's key, because one of the major gaps that exists is the fact that, first of all, there is no specific funding available for loss and damage. When we think about it, not just in response to actual disasters and in the immediate aftermath, but also in the longer term, right? And also when we think about slow onset events, there is no funding available anywhere for those states that are consistently losing actual parts of their territory to advancing sea level rise. There's no funding available anywhere for what is termed non-economic losses. So there are a number of gaps that need to be addressed. And then we also have to think about who are the recipients, who is going to be the recipients of this funding. And so those are just some of the ways in which the fund needs to be different. But I think the final arrangements are still subject to a lot of discussion and a lot of negotiation. I think the key thing is that this year we need to have a decision to actually establish this fund.
Yeah, Harjeet-Singh, let me bring you in on this one as well.
Sure, totally agree with Dionne, and let me unpack a few details. So at COP26 conference last year in Glasgow, there was an discussion, G77 in China as the biggest bloc of developing countries representing 85% of population put forward this proposal, but it was not accepted. What was offered to us was Glasgow Dialogue, and a 3-year Glasgow Dialogue and just one session every year, which we know is not sufficient to develop a facility or a funding arrangement that we desperately need. And it's really time for us to start unpacking, as Rueanna said, at this COP27, we must agree to establish the facility. And as Climate Action Network, we developed a proposal which we shared with several negotiators. And we also talked about how the focus has to be on addressing loss and damage, because one challenge that we are facing is the language of averting and minimizing that has been added to the whole issue of loss and damage. And that pillar has to be a new pillar under the current financial mechanisms. And we are not saying that every single penny has to be now routed through this fund, but this fund must be able to overall coordinate, mobilize, and channel new and additional funding that people need at this moment. It has to be driven by countries. And as Rueanna said, this year is important for us to agree. Next year, the operational details can be worked out. And third year, the money should start flowing to developing countries. And this is the kind of timeline we are looking at. So which means that decision at this COP27 is absolutely fundamental to make sure that the dialogues and discussions that we are doing are taking us to a concrete milestone and output, and not just continue to talk when people on the ground are suffering and they're losing their homes, crops, and income.
Dr. Perry, do you think we have a realistic chance of achieving those kinds of timelines, given that last year at COP26, it had been hoped that would see the establishment of the fund, but instead we got the Glasgow Dialogue, which is more talking until 2024. So how much progress do you think is realistic to expect on this issue, as Harjeet-Singh is saying?
I'm not sure. I think I am a little, I'm not very optimistic, because if we've arrived at this point after 30 years, it might take us another 30 years, which we're hoping that it does not. I think a large part of some of what has happened is that much of the technical and the technocratic language around loss and damage has eliminated or disposed of a much broader politics that is necessary around the question of ecological debt, for example. Right, so this is where the conversation started back in the 90s around ecological debt and what global North countries owed, not in these is very kind of instrumentalist kinds of way, or not in these very technical ways about fund, do this, and all of that is necessary. But what ends up happening, just like what happened with the Green Climate Fund, for instance, is that the thing gets hijacked by global north countries, and eventually the whole system gets it is distorted, and it does not meet the needs of communities that require rapid response. For instance, rapid response funds when there's a major disaster to meet needs such as water, basic infrastructure, basic sanitation and health. Those are the issues that people who experience these climate impacts, they're the issues that they're concerned of. If we're talking at a very high level about the operationalization of the fund, and it does not actually address those kinds of needs, then we're actually not making very much sense to the communities who require the support when they've been hit by major climate impacts.
Okay, before I wrap up this particular segment, I just want to go back to Dr. Wewerinke-Singh for just a moment. And Dr., given the fact that the advisory opinions we were talking about a little earlier are, as described, advisory, not binding, how much value would they have, especially in the case of an ICJ opinion, given that, as you yourself have pointed out, China and the US, two of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases, don't recognize the jurisdiction of the World Court?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, when it comes to the legal nature of an advisory opinion, of course, it's just advice. But then again, it is advisory opinions from the ICJ do carry tremendous legal weight and moral authority. So even though an advisory opinion as such is not binding, what the court is clarifying is existing law, which is very much binding. So what the court says cannot be directly enforced, but certainly indirectly can influence domestic litigation. Domestic courts that issue binding rulings are very likely to look at what the International Court of Justice has to say on the issue. And the same goes also for international courts and tribunals, which are increasingly approached with questions about climate change. So this guidance is going to be influential in that setting, but also in the negotiations when it comes to affirming very basic principles, such as the obligation of states to act with due diligence to prevent transboundary environmental harm, but also that the basic principle that a breach of an international obligation triggers an obligation to make full reparations for the harm caused. That is a very well-established principle of law, and of law generally and of international law. So if the ICJ making a pronouncement on this is going to really bolster the negotiation position of developing countries in the negotiations in the quest for loss and damage, really clarifying this is not a matter of charity, but a matter of applying existing rules that are very well established and that are at the heart of the international legal order.
Yeah, which goes to the heart of the whole question of climate justice. All right, thank you all so very much. We're going to take questions now from the audience. And so I know you all have been dropping questions in the chat. Let's see how many we can get to. We're going to start though with two pre-recorded questions from two people in the audience. We're going to be asking our panelists just to turn off their videos and mute just while we run these questions.
There have been extreme events of climate change in Africa, especially in Nigeria, where 70% of the population depend on agriculture. And here in Nigeria, agriculture depends on the weather condition. We are at the mercy of weather condition where there are no mechanized farming. So are farmers now really to depend on indigenous knowledge to manage climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, because there are no extension agents in Nigeria to bring the latest innovation of resilience approaches to farmers. Things are very difficult. So how are farmers going to cope with the situation, especially here in Nigeria? Thank you.
My name is Eva Peace Mukairanga. I'm part of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. I'll be attending COP27, and loss and damage finance is a key criteria for a successful COP27. We are living in the era of climate change impacts, and the news feed is filled with climate disasters such as floods, killing hundreds of people and affecting thousands. But yet the cost of loss and damage is paid by those least responsible by the climate crisis. My question is, what are the key elements for a good COP27 decision on loss and damage finance?
Who wants to take the first question? What are farmers to do, given all the difficulties that had been described there? Anybody wants to jump in on, or should I ask?
I can start, Dionne, if you like.
Please go ahead.
I think it's a very important question for all developing countries. And as we know that agriculture happens to be one of the key pillars of their economy, and that's related to our food security. So if farmers are suffering from climate impacts and we are not able to produce food as much as it's needed, we are all going to be crisis. We are already facing food crisis, and inflation and energy crisis because of a war situation. Coming to climate impacts, which are exacerbating the current context, I think it's really important for farmers in Nigeria and all developing countries to have access to information, which is extremely important. Indigenous knowledge is a bedrock for agriculture, but now that has to be blended with the scientific information that's coming as part of modeling, that's coming in terms of early warning information, which is not only just now useful for for disasters, but also for day-to-day information, when to sow, when to harvest, when to use fertilizers. So all that information from blending with scientific knowledge is going to be extremely useful. And developing countries have to now start assessing how at current levels of warming and the increasing number of impacts are affecting farming systems, and how we can use traditional knowledge and new scientific systems to develop varieties that are going to be able to deal with these climate impacts. We know that there is erratic rain patterns, and there's less rain, more rain. So it's more about really building capacity of farmers and having more research institutions and making sure that the support is available when their crop fails. And this is where the role of international community comes in. So really looking at actions from local level to national level to global levels. From global levels, we need financing, and at the local and national level, we need to build capacity to make sure that farmers have access to those tools and information.
Thank you so much. The second question was from the Youth Coalition. What were the elements of a loss and damage, I guess you might say success story, look like coming out of COP27? Who wants to take that? Rueanna?
Maybe I'll jump in here. Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here. But first, on the previous question, I really just want to endorse everything that Harjeet has said on this. And I think I would add one thing. There is also going to be a key need for there to be a sharing of knowledge and indigenous practices amongst farmers in developing countries. I think that indigenous practices really will help us to be able to deal with this crisis, but they do need to be combined, as Harjeet said, with the latest science and technology and the finance and the support. But that sharing of knowledge will also be critical. On the question of what are the elements of a good COP27 decision on loss and damage finance, first of all, we need to see that there is an acknowledgement of the existing gaps. This has been, a key sticking point in the discussion where, for the most part, countries of the global north seem to be convinced that the existing structure, the hodgepodge ad hoc financing and insurance facilities that are available in the humanitarian sphere, for example, are sufficient to address loss and damage if combined with, what is happening in relation to adaptation. And those on the ground know very well that this is not the case, and the IPCC has now supported that this is not the case. It is insufficient, and we need to have an acknowledgement of that as a starting off point for the global community's work on this. The second is that we need the agreement to establish a fund that will be fit for purpose. Not just any fund, it has to be multilateral, it has to be a part of the financial mechanism under the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and it has to be fit for purpose so that we know that it's actually responding to needs. And finally, a commitment for the further operationalization of the fund later on, as Harjeet described. We are not trying to agree the whole hog now. And in fact, I think that would be a trap that we fall into if we want to insist or if we are led down the road where we need to solve every problem in terms of how this fund will operate before we can even agree that it is established. We need to have a commitment that that conversation will continue after this COP. Thanks.
Since you're on, Rueanna, a question directly for you very quickly, if you could. How will loss and damage financing be separated from specific displaced persons financing?
Why would we need to separate that financing? I think this is, again, one of those questions that could quickly lead us down the road of trying to solve every problem before we actually establish that we will be setting up a fund for loss and damage financing. I'm not aware of the extent of funding arrangements already available for displaced persons. I imagine that it is insufficient and that it actually probably doesn't specifically cover those situations where persons are displaced as a result of climate impacts. So I imagine that this will also be included in the context of loss and damage financing and in the context of the fund once it is established. But these types of details are still to be worked out, at least from my point of view.
Thank you so much. Dr. Perry, I think perhaps you could take this one coming from Rizal Kabir from Bangladesh, former Secretary of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Could debt cancellation be accepted, you think, as a mechanism for reparations to share loss and damage by the developed economies to help climate affected countries?
Yes, I think, and we have to go back to, there have been a number of these kinds of demands made for a very long time. So if we go back to 2010 at the Cochabamba People's Forum, over 35,000 people who came together in Bolivia demanded a list of various forms of compensation, and debt cancellation was one of them. In the Caribbean, for instance, we have the majority of small island countries already have more than 100% of GDP, which they have in terms of debt, right? Public debt owed to both multilateral as well as private lenders. We have a huge problem of debt, which means that one, resources are being held up in terms of paying debt payments and interest on debt, as opposed to budgets being assigned to address climate impacts. The issue around that as well is that the multilateral agencies like the IMF, the World Bank, and so on are issuing more debt. So on top of when countries are faced with climate impacts, instead of addressing those particular impacts and recognizing the responsibility of global north countries to the global south, they are being crippled with additional debt, which after a major environmental event. And so debt cancellation has to be a core issue. I think we have to be very ambitious. If we are not ambitious, if we don't put those issues at center, we're going to end up with a very lackluster, very unambitious, and a mechanism that does not address some of those issues. And I think many of global South countries have actually put a target on that in the trillions of dollars. We're not talking about $100 billion, which was set in 2009. We're talking about trillions of dollars. So I think our ambition needs to be very, very up there with respect to the actual needs of people and communities in the global South.
we have two interesting questions coming in as well. Nancy Ann is asking, and Harjeet Singh, I'm going to come to you on this. Do you think we'll ever reach a point where there will be a crimes against nature with consequences? And Nancy Ann says, I'm thinking of Gary Snyder, who believed that trees should have the right to vote.
Well, absolutely. And this is something I think we're walking in that direction already. There are several cases where we have won the rights of nature, Mother Earth. We have been able to recognize, in my own country, there was a case where river was recognized as a living being. So there are some very positive cases in that direction. And that's what we have to do. Somehow when we talk about rights and we talk about human rights, we have to talk about rights of Mother Nature as well. And that's the only way we can, even we as humanity, if we look at our own self-interest, we can survive on this planet. This planet is going to survive, in different forms and shape. But if we were to survive, we have to respect, we talk about human rights, but also rights of nature. So I think we are walking in that direction. And we're also now recognizing how important nature is for us. So I think that realization is there. There are some positive cases. We now have to put it right at the center of our conversation alongside human rights. So yeah, there is a lot more support of that concept now.
And we have another question coming from Nisha Abir, who is asking, and I know some of these are framed as legal and international law questions, but I think they have such interesting wider implications as well. So Rueanna, I'm going to throw this to you. What do you think about the idea of criminalizing ecocide at the international level, for instance, by amending the relevant legislation, the Rome Statute, as a way of slowing down the pace of ecosystem destruction and biodiversity loss?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic initiative that's long overdue. So I know that efforts have been on the way in that sense, and I think they are gaining traction now. My own view is that all efforts, all hands on deck, all efforts are necessary at this point in time for us to deal with the climate crisis that is already underway. The IPCC has been very, very, very clear. This is the critical decade. Whether or not we will be living in an absolute hellscape of uncontrollable climate change and climate impacts within this century depends upon what we do in the next few years. So all efforts are welcome in that regard. And I think the ecocide, the criminalization of ecocide through the ICC, that effort is definitely welcome. And I hope that it will continue to gain traction.
Okay, Dr. Wewerinke-Singh, and speaking of eras, I know we're in the Zoom era, so we asked her just to go off cam for a little bit to ensure that we can hear her properly. Emily Ponte-Corvo is asking, can you describe what the General Assembly's resolution would ask the ICJ to do specifically?
That's a great question. And one that I cannot answer directly because the resolution is not in the public domain yet. It is being negotiated first within a core group of states that support the initiative, and then it will ultimately be tabled at the UNGA. But basically, of course, what it does, in the gist of it, is that it seeks to bring together different areas of international law to really make clear that climate action is not a matter of voluntary contributions or voluntary commitments, but that it is something that is informed by existing legal norms, including human rights norms, and that seeks to also clarify and then strengthen the position of those who are most affected by the adverse effects of climate change.
Okay, would you also comment on the question that we got there about ecocide? Is it time to start looking at amending the Rome Statute to include ecocide?
Yeah, I completely agree with Rueanna's answer on this. I think indeed we need all hands on deck when it comes to addressing climate change. We can't afford to leave any stone unturned. And when it comes to criminalizing ecocide, it may sound like a radical idea, but it's maybe one of the least radical ideas that is around, because it would only affect the most serious, most extreme forms of environmental destruction. And indeed, I agree with Rueanna. It's long overdue that kind of conduct is criminalized.
Dr. Perry, let me put this to you from Dr. Subhash Deb, who says, yesterday our country was battered by Cyclone Citrang. Drought, heavy rain, no rains, flash floods we face every year. The number of climate refugees breaking down in subtropical areas is increasing every day. Underdeveloped countries are suffering from climate change due to unplanned development of industrialized countries. What is the world, I'm not sure if this is World Health, but World Organization doing in this case? What do you think should be done?
That is a difficult one, because I think dealing with the everyday of the climate impacts, right, and dealing with trying to find the gestation period between those impacts and the solutions at the moment is very long, right? And that has been a problem that countries that are continually and repeatedly facing these kinds of disasters, right? I think it comes to the core of the question that we've been asked, right? And the sort of topic today is climate reparations are absolutely essential, right? It's not, as Margaretha has been saying, it's not about voluntary contributions anymore. It's about recognizing, one, why we have got to the point that we are at, why certain countries, especially Black and brown countries that are racialized, countries that have had a colonial past, why are these countries particularly exposed and vulnerable? It has to come to those particular questions, and why those countries that have a large number of other problems, so impoverishment, problems around agriculture, problems around a host of other problems that are related to their development, why are they particularly challenged when they experience these particular problems? It's because of the situation that they've been put in historically, and the kind of continued post-development, post-colonial extractive development that we have seen in many of those countries. So reparations have to be central to how we meet the current challenge and how we actually meet the needs of those peoples and the communities that are facing these kinds of impacts on a continual and a repeated basis.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to move on to section 3. And at this point, if our panel weren't star-studded enough, we're adding more star power. We're bringing in now Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, who is the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt. Can I ask you to turn on your video, sir? Thank you so much. It's so fantastic to have you join us as well. In this segment now, we want to talk about building solidarity between small and vulnerable states. And Dr. Perry, I'm going to stick with you because we already had a number of institutions, right? So we have CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community. We have PIFS, which is the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. We had AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. And I'm trying to break it down because I know we all swim in an alphabet soup of acronyms here in the climate space. So do you think, Dr. Perry, that those institutions have been working together in order to advance their cause?
I think many of those institutions actually have been doing a great deal of yeoman service when it comes to addressing many of these problems together, right? The OASIS is actually one of the prime institutions where that is concerned in terms of advocacy, in terms of pushing an agenda that meets climate justice needs of people in small island countries, and they have been really pushing on a number of fronts, right? And the issue of loss and damage was put forward, correct me if I'm wrong, by OASIS countries in the first place. So they have been very, very important to working on issues because of they see this as a common problem and they have common experiences where these are concerned. The challenge they have faced and some of the stumbling blocks they have faced is because many of these countries are smaller countries in terms of GDP, in terms of political power at the global level, many of their demands, requests, and so on have been ignored. Many of their demands and many of their particular needs have been marginalized in large respect. And that's why we've still been discussing loss and damage after 30 years, right? So the issue around what we need is a civic movement at all levels, both in the global north, both in the global south, acknowledging why we are at the point we're at and moving together. It's not only these countries. If these countries continue to face these impacts, we're going to have problems of climate refugees, right? We're going to have major problems in terms of many of these communities not being able to meet their economic and social needs and so on. So that's why we need a movement at a really transnational level to put forward these particular demands and demand reparations as a very core element of that strategy.
So when we add to that now, Rueanna, Haynes, when we add to that the Commission of Small Island States and international law, are we adding institutions that are bolstering the effort, or are we kind of dissipating our energies here?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say on this is that all of the institutions you've outlined are very, very, very qualitatively different in terms of the nature of the institution, in terms of the sphere within which it operates, in terms of how it operates. So for example, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, is not in itself an institution. It's not a formal body. It's informal. It's a political grouping. You know, it's designed around a voluntary participation of AOSIS members to advocate for issues that those countries hold in common. And it spans the range from climate change, also oceans issues, also sustainable development issues for small island states. Whereas organizations such as the Commission are a lot more ad hoc in nature. The participation is a lot smaller than AOSIS. And then you have sort of the regional organizations, which are quite formal institutions like CARICOM, like the PIFs, etc. So all of these organizations are quite different in their level of formality and also in terms of their membership and their sphere of influence. And I think I stand by what I said earlier, that we are in a crisis. And so that means all hands on deck. I think that as long as the governments, because there's a lot of overlap in terms of participation, as long as governments are able to ensure that their views are aligned across these different organizations and groupings that they are participating in, then it all contributes to the greater good and to amplifying the messages that need to be amplified. Because as Keston has said, these are not countries with global economic power. These are countries that have occupied a marginalized space in the context of, you know, global institutions and global conversations. And so any opportunity to be able to amplify voices and messages and leverage influence is one that I think we should rightfully be welcoming.
Well, let me ask you to pick up on that, though, when you speak about all hands on deck. So what additional support could the Commission use?
Well, I don't know if I can speak specifically to the Commission. This might be a question more for Dr. Wewerinke-Singh. I do think, though, that since the Commission has come into being, yes, it's been, you know, they've done a good job in terms of the media and actually getting some of the messages out there, but there is still not a lot of clarity around the Commission's core objectives and how those core objectives link into the global discussion and the potential that they have to link into the global discussion. So maybe there could be some more work done in that area that might also make it possible for more countries to be able to join that effort. It's not very clear, you know, how the raising this climate change issue in the law of the sea space is going to progress discussions, especially since there are a lot of discussions already happening in that sphere that are ancillary but may be related in ways that have yet really to be fully explained. So maybe some additional information is what might be useful.
Sure. Let me bring in Dr. Wewerinke-Singh on that point, Doctor. So first of all, that comment on the commission, from where you sit, what additional support does it need? What else should we do to help in its mandate?
Yeah, these are important questions. I think here it's also important to provide some context. The Commission is also an initiative that really comes from the two first founding member states, that is Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda, who together basically felt that it was necessary to take a step of ensuring that the international rule of law applies to climate change, because the international rule of law is not being respected naturally, apparently. And so something needed to happen. And so they asked for some assistance from lawyers to help draft this instrument, but there is no big power or institution or funding even behind this effort. So that also means that everything needs to be developed in a way on the go. So when it comes to, for example, information about what is the exact mandate that the Commission will do, besides what is mentioned in the founding agreement, all of that needs to be still developed. So the founding agreement is available online, that can be read, and it talks about, for example, ensuring that contributing to the progressive development, the clarification and progressive development of international law as it applies to climate change, particularly damage to the marine environment. So that is clear. But how that will happen, of course, there are many possibilities. One of those is requesting an advisory opinion from ITLOS, which is something that the Commission that is established under the agreement is specifically mandated to do. But of course, there are other ways as well in which this clarification and progressive development of international law can be achieved. And so what I can share is the Commission has established a committee of legal experts. I am one of those legal experts who is privileged to serve under that for the Commission. And this committee has established a number of subcommittees, including one, for example, on human rights, one on loss and damage, one on basically chapter 12 of UNCLOS on protection and preservation of the marine environment, and one on UNCLOS, the law of the sea more generally. And so there will be work done in those areas. But again, it is very much still under development.
Okay, but following on that as well, what about support for the Vanuatu initiative?
So for Vanuatu, there's a really very clear role of civil society organizations and movements and citizens from all around the world, making sure that all states, UN member states, support the initiative, press the green button when it is put to a vote at the UN General Assembly, and also to encourage governments, states to play a constructive role in the negotiations, because of course there's a resolution text, and there will be states that will attempt to dilute the question as it goes in the climate negotiations when it comes to text. So we also have text negotiations here. And so civil society can encourage states to be constructive and to preserve the integrity of the legal question that must be posed to the courts.
I'd love to bring in Dr. Mohieldin on this particular subject in terms of the solidarity and where perhaps you think you would like to see more emphasis on building those alliances and emphasizing that solidarity to move this issue forward.
Right. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you what I can see of relevance to your discussion today in the preparation of COP27, by which Egypt will be starting its presidency as a coordinator. It's an African country, it's a developing economy, it's a middle-income country. It's not a Commonwealth country, but it has very strong ties with the Commonwealth members, and I've been attending many of the very good meetings organized by the Commonwealth and many of the subgroupings as well. Having said that, there are 5 things that you need really to consider when you are trying to navigate in the climate action agenda in a fast-changing world. And the fact, yes, we had a Paris Agreement binding and everything, but we are not in 2015 anymore. There were some promises here and there in different COPs, including more recently in COP26 in Glasgow. But again, the political economy dynamics are tougher than where we were back in the UK in Glasgow. And everybody's realizing that. So it's basically updating our positions and our arguments in knowledge sharing on how can we do a better job in enhancing the common concern and efforts toward dealing with this common concern and the knowledge that is required to deal with this common concern about the climate action. We cannot take it off the agenda simply because there are wars, and there is one, or because there is a pandemic, and there was one and still is with us with its impact, and many countries still suffering from the impact of the pandemic. And there is a financial crisis looming in many countries with more than 56 countries to the 55 countries suffering from debt and debt distress. So we need really to build our position better based on the latest information and evidence. The first part of relevance, there are 5. The first is a holistic approach. I think of the discussion that I've been hearing, a holistic approach to climate action, that we cannot really do climate action that can result in more poverty or more inequality or more losses of jobs. This we need really to emphasize. And that holistic approach is not just about the Paris Agreement, that we need to have mitigation and adaptation, and we need to push the agenda on the loss and damage, and we need to take finance seriously. These are the 4 main building blocks of the Paris Agreement. But we need definitely to link the whole thing to sustainability and the impact on poverty. The second issue is about implementation. I think developing economies are, well, to use a more diplomatic word than others, I would say fed up, and there is a lack of trust of the many promises. Most of them ended to be empty, and many pledges that have never been delivered, including on the finance. So now it's about solutions and how can we make those who made these pledges accountable for what they said, and pushing them to do more on what they have been doing, and actually praise those who delivered. When we say advanced economies didn't deliver in their 100 billion, it is not entirely true, because 6 countries out of 23 have managed to do well in that front. Germany, France, some of the Nordic countries included, but others didn't. So we need really to make sure that those who are doing the right thing, they need to be commended and praised, to encourage them to continue and do more. And those who didn't, we need really to put some light on that. The third is very related to your work. It's basically about the regional grouping and the different groupings that we have. There is a regional dimension of the work on the climate action agenda, including in the implementation. And we have 5 regional economic commissions of the UN. I started with Africa with my team, and then went to the Latin America and the Caribbean, then Asia, then the Arab countries, Middle East, and then emerging Europe. To build pipeline of investable, and I'm not saying bankable, investable, because we had enough of funding activities based on debt innocence. We need more finance based on investment and private equity participation, not to increase our debt burden further. Then there is a great work of localization, and then of course finance through the 100 billion that needs to be revised, less dependence on debt. We need to have debt reduction mechanisms. It's great to see countries like Belize, Seychelles, and more recently Barbados are working on. Barbados is a Commonwealth country as well. We need to make sure that these solutions coming from debt reduction mechanism, debt swaps, investing the proceeds in climate and nature is being adequately understood and pushed further. Carbon credit markets do not serve the purpose of developing economies. We have a very good one in Europe, serving Europe. We have an excellent one growing in the US, serving the US. But the European model could be used as a good model, as the Chinese benefited from it. I attended a very good meeting led by Prime Minister Maya Mottley, and she was mentioning things about collaboration between African countries and the Caribbean countries, but using the standards and the advances in knowledge that had been developed elsewhere. And then we need to work definitely better on the ESG finance and how to make our budgets more aligned with the priorities of the SDGs. So these 5 pillars, holistic approach, implementation, regionalization, localization, and finance, focusing on investment and partnership with the private sector, are going to be what we should be expecting going forward.
Thank you so very much for that. And before I end this segment, Dr. Perry, I promised I'd come back to you, acknowledging the colonial history of the Commonwealth and the flack it still takes for that. And of course, we heard your criticisms a little earlier on. How can the Commonwealth, you think, help us to make progress on this issue of climate reparations at COP27?
This is a tough one because in my view, I am not sure the Commonwealth as an organization should exist, right? For the very fact of its history and some of what it has, the role it has played and continues to play around the world, right? If we are to exist in a world where the Commonwealth is still here, perhaps its role can be, how does it realize and materialize the demand for reparations among former colonized countries, act as a conduit between those formerly colonized countries and the states in the global north, corporate high earning elites and so on, who are, for instance, still benefiting from plantations in the Caribbean. We have one member of parliament and a former prime minister of Great Britain who have both benefited from enslavement, right? So if it can play a role, it can be a conduit for extracting those finances that are necessary for reparations and offering a way to deliver those to either regional bodies, community structured organizations, or in some instances, governments. So that is my take on perhaps how it might transition from its current one as a sort of multilateral organization. I mean, there's been questions around its effectiveness even in that regard. Okay. So, I mean, we need to, think about it really hard and make some difficult decisions where that is concerned.
Right. I'm going to actually do a very quick round robin on this issue, because I'd love everybody else's thoughts. Rueanna, Haynes, maybe in a sentence, what most significantly do you think the Commonwealth could do to advance this issue at COP27?
I think maybe picking up on what Keston has said, I think the Commonwealth as an organization has a responsibility to ensure that the historical, the history of exploitation that surrounds the genesis of the organization is corrected. And what that means is that as an organization, it should really be focused on rallying its developed country members in support of the legitimate demands of those members from the global south on this issue. The Commonwealth is well positioned to be able to amplify the voices of the vulnerable. And I think if there is to be value in how the organization moves forward in the current world that we live in, then that should really be the focus of its effort.
Harjeet Singh, same question to you.
So just building on what Rueanna and Dr. Perry said, I think from rich countries from the Commonwealth first have to recognize that this is an issue of reparations when we talk about loss and damage, and it's about responsibility and obligations. But at the same time, we know that when we go to these UN negotiations, those kind of words will not be accepted. So what Commonwealth has to do is to promote the spirit of cooperation and solidarity, and also demonstrate through its actions by moving away from the extractive model of development. So I think making that commitment, and then also stopping the new colonialism that we are seeing right now, especially the kind of drilling and digging that's happening in Africa in the name of energy security. So there's a lot that Commonwealth has to do, and what it's going to say matters, because when Scotland and Wallonia came forward and talked about climate justice, supported the cause of loss and damage at COP26 in Glasgow, it mattered. So first is recognize that it's an issue of reparations, and a lot needs to happen in the UN space, adopting the spirit of cooperation and solidarity. That's the starting point. And of course, a lot then has to be then followed up in terms of real finance and following the right model of development and not the extractive one that has brought us to this crisis, and multiple crises, in fact.
Dr. Wewerinke-Singh, final word from you on this issue. Your thoughts, what the Commonwealth can add.
No, I agree with basically everything that the previous speakers have said. And I would add international law perspective also, making sure international rule of law is complied with. And that includes also, for example, when it comes to the implementation of the CHAGOS advisory opinion, there is important work to do on the part of states that are affected by that opinion, to make sure that they show that they listen to what the court has to say about the application of international law and actually comply with the opinion.
Okay, thank you so much. We're now moving into our final segment. What can we expect from COP27? Don't you all scream and shout at once. Let me start with Dr. Mohieldin. Dr. Mohieldin, COP26 was disappointing for a lot of activists who really had hoped to see more progress on the issue of loss and damage. What realistically do you think we can expect this time around on loss and damage financing?
Right. Okay. So without immediate action on the loss and damage, there will be loss and damage. There will be more cases like Pakistan that has 1/3 of its land covered by water. There will be more issues of concern about, even when you have this impact that have been estimated to be about more than $30 billion of more funding, half of which is attributed to climate action, and the other half is about malpractices and annual variation in weather. But I'm
so sorry. I'm going to stop you just for a moment. Perhaps I didn't express myself correctly. In terms of progress, though, what realistically do you think we're going to see in terms of progress?
Yeah, I got that. I'm just saying that we need to put the evidence for loss and damage beyond the history. We need to put it in current issues that we see very strong evidence for, as we see it in cases in small islands, in Pakistan and other places. So 3 things are happening as we speak. One is the request from the Egyptian presidency to Germany and Chile to co-lead efforts to have a revisiting of all of the elements about operationalization of the provisions of the Paris Agreement, and revive the network mechanism associated with the Santiago, and to revisit as well that fund that was created in Glasgow, but with very limited amount of funds, only a token contribution from the city of Glasgow and from Brussels. The second part, there is some role of the non-state actors, which I represent, but unfortunately is constrained by the extent of progress by the negotiators. But there is role of lawyers, insurance companies, those who can help in assessment of damage at community level, and there are some cases that started to be there. The third is the role of university think tanks and research centers in providing sufficient evidence and making the difference between what's in the mitigation front, what's in the adaptation, and what is requiring more attention to that file that had been missing for many years endlessly in areas related to the loss and damage. So these are basically the 3 areas that may give us some light of progress on the loss and damage file, which I hope to see some good progress in, because without progress on the state side of negotiation, there is very little for the private sector. Let's not be misled. the private sector, the insurance companies, and community-based work will not really fix the huge damages and losses associated with malpractices in the domain of climate for many years. So that is basically the kind of work we're expecting.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move right into questions because we have so many, as you can imagine, coming in from the members of the audience. Carolyn Savage is asking, and I'm going to put this to Rueanna, Haynes. Carolyn says, we talk about climate action. When looking at the devastation due to the recent tornado in Tonga, lives, homes, businesses all destroyed, will the loss and damage fund also look at ensuring women are at the decision table and have access to this fund in their countries? Unfortunately, they're the ones that have the biggest burden, but do not always get the financial support after these devastating events.
No, it's a good question, but as I've said, the actual nuts and bolts of how the fund will operate are yet to be decided, and I don't think will feature majorly at this COP. What I will say, though, is that in the context of what has been proposed by the Alliance of Small Island States, exactly that type of action is foreseen for the fund. This is why AOSIS is insisting that the fund has to be fit for purpose. And this is also why they've included that civil society and representatives from civil society need to have a voice and need to sit within the fund to be able to raise these types of issues and ensure that funding is being channeled where it's needed the most. And that's actually quite a revolutionary type of arrangement for a multilateral fund of this nature. So even, being able to come to the table and have that negotiated is going to be like pushing a very large stone up a very steep hill. So we will need all the support we can get to ensure that this fund is truly able to get to those local levels and to those actors that need it the most. But this is a fight for the years to come.
Well, let me follow up on that question with a question for Harjeet Singh. This question from Navina Sadasivam saying, what would then be a process for determining a specific amount for the fund? When should we start talking dollar values, or is it too early to have that conversation?
That's a very important question, and I agree with Rueanna. We have to sequence things properly. I think at this very COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, we have to recognize the scale of finance that is needed. There are many estimates, starting from 290 to $580 billion a year by 2030 in developing countries alone. But this is not the time to pin that down, but recognize the gap. And that's why need for an institution to bridge the gap. And those calculations should start, and those numbers have to be now recognized and acknowledged by the UN system. We have Standing Committee on Finance, which should actually do an assessment based on the estimates available. And then we should also look at sources. In the paper that we brought out as Climate Action Network and many allies, we did talk about various sources that can be used in raising that resource. Even UNSG also talked about the windfall profits that fossil fuel companies are making, how that can be taxed. So there are a number of ways we can raise that money. We need to recognize the gap, and then that's why we need a system under UNFCCC to channel that money. And that's why, as Rueanna has been saying, we need a multilateral system, and that's where we need to talk about the quantum of money, sources of money, and how it needs to be channeled to people, communities, and countries who need it most.
Dr. Perry Gabita Sastry from India is asking, why is it that wars and defense budgets aren't talked about when we're dealing with climate finance and development? Why are they treated as sacrosanct?
We should ask the politicians wars and military, right? I mean, this has been an issue in the United States, right? United States military is the largest, the Pentagon is the largest consumer of hydrocarbons globally, right? Institutional consumer. And so, I mean, it's more than even a mid-sized country like Peru or Sweden, for instance, right? In terms of its carbon emissions. So these particular entities have been protected from the kinds of scrutiny because of the balance of power in those countries that are very much pro-military. The damage that the military has done through various wars, it's widespread. I'm currently in Senegal. Its widespread impact on the African continent, for instance, is absolutely astronomical, and its continued perpetuation of many of the injustices that are linked, in fact, to climate change and the impacts of climate change. So the military is definitely has to be a major target of not only reform, but in many instances, dismantlement in many countries where it has had that kind of impact, you know, through its various kinds of operations. So definitely the military, I think my answer concurs with the questioner in that the military has to be an important target for you know, change and you know, drastic change if we actually are going to have the impact on delivering climate justice to those communities and people most marginalized.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one final question, which I think is very interesting in this context. I'm not sure who anyone can take this. Nicole is asking about the current high inflation and imminent recession. How do these issues impact the discussion, seeing that the G7 countries are focused now on their own challenges?
Yeah, if I may tackle this issue, and very briefly, if I may, on the preparation of the climate agenda, and you will see that reflected from the 7th to the 17th. We are not dealing with the climate action in isolation, with food prices, with lack of access to energy, or issues related to indebtedness. These are the three big issues of concern. We have stagflation and recession hitting many countries. We have hyperinflation in many countries and lack of access to food and energy. And we're trying to put the climate action agenda as part of the solution, not in the immediate term because they require investments, but definitely bringing the attention that the world cannot really go on relying on fossil fuel alone. Just transition would require investments in renewables, and there are many good examples, including solar, wind, and green hydrogen led by African countries and many developing economies. A food system is to benefit from investment in adaptation, and there is a new line of business that could encourage the private sector to participate. Currently, the private sector is only contributing less than 2% of investments in the adaptation front. There should be some solutions to that, and we're providing some sort of partnerships, supporting with the risking and the MDBs to enhance finance for adaptation. So food, energy, and the issues related to inflation and unemployment are very much there in the discussions. It's not just about Paris Agreement, it's Paris Agreement and the impact of climate action on the rest of sustainable development goals.
Thank you so very much for that. Boy, what a fantastic discussion. I think now you see why I said our panelists deserved a drum roll. In 2017, one of our own Caribbean Prime Ministers, Roosevelt, Skerrit of Dominica, in one of the most powerful speeches I've heard, said to the UN General Assembly that he had come straight from the front line of the war on climate change. That was a year that we had 2 Cat 5 hurricanes devastating the Caribbean. He spoke of digging graves for those who had been killed by the storms. He spoke of flattened homes, destroyed infrastructure. He told the General Assembly that we as a region did not start this war against nature. The war had come to us. And he said there was no more time for conversation, that the time for action was now. That was 5 years ago. Small island states are pushing harder than ever for action, and the ideas and strategies we've heard this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are, will, we hope, help to move the conversation and the process forward. So please make a note. The Commonwealth Foundation's next critical conversation is going to be after COP. It's going to be on Tuesday, November 29th, 5 p.m. GMT. Fantastic topic, art and climate justice, re-imaging the future. We'll have another fantastic lineup of speakers for you, all of them artists, and they'll be talking about how art can bring personal perspectives on climate change, how it can reframe our worldview in ways that other forms of advocacy can't. They'll also showcase their work on screen. Please please join us. We're so sorry we didn't get to all the fantastic questions we had coming in from all around the world, but you can continue the conversation. Join the Commonwealth Foundation's digital discussion platform. It's a fantastic, innovative space. It's a space for activists, practitioners, artists, civil society leaders. So everybody who is here, you'll be able to network, to share ideas, to build solidarity around the ideas we've been talking about. In Jamaica, we would say to you, go join the man. In other words, in English, please join. So please use the link that we're going to post in the Zoom chat. There's also going to be a QR code coming. Join, meet, strategize, really, really important with other climate activists. And we also want you to continue the conversation on social media. Or Twitter handle is @Commonwealth.org, same on Instagram. For everybody who is coming to the press briefing, please stay on the link. It's going to start in about 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks to our fantastic panelists. Bye-bye.